The camera is running. The room is small, government issue, a jail interview room in Bellingham, Washington, in the spring of 1979. On one side of the table sits a psychiatrist with decades of experience in hypnosis and dissociative states. On the other side sits a 27-year-old man with soft features, a calm voice, and the posture of someone who has never once raised his hand in anger. His name is Kenneth Bianchi. He is polite. He is articulate. He is, by every surface measure, the least threatening person in the building, and then the psychiatrist asks to speak to someone else, someone who might be inside Kenneth. The young man's head drops, his shoulders change. When he looks up again, the voice that comes out of his mouth is lower, coarser, contemptuous. It introduces itself as Steve, and Steve begins to laugh about murder. Steve says he killed those girls down in Los Angeles. He says Ken, the man whose body he is borrowing, knows nothing about it. He mocks Ken. He calls him a turkey. He describes losing time the way a broken clock loses time, and he finds it funny. Across the table, the psychiatrist listens, and he believes what he's hearing. He will not be the only one. Before this case is over, multiple mental health experts, respected, credentialed, experienced, will examine Kenneth Bianchi and conclude that he is insane, that he suffers from multiple personality disorder, that the man who terrorized Los Angeles was not really Kenneth Bianchi at all, but a hidden entity living inside him, committing atrocities his host personality never knew about. Every word of it was a performance. That is what makes this case different from almost every other file in the archive of American serial murder. The Hillside Strangler case is remembered for the panic it caused, for the 10 women and girls left on the slopes above Los Angeles, for the discovery that the strangler was not one man, but 2. But the deepest layer of this case is not what happened on those hillsides. It is what happened in that interview room, because the Hillside Strangler case is the story of a lie with 2 stages. First, 2 killers hid inside one identity, an invented phantom the media called the Hillside Strangler, while cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono moved through the city unsuspected. Then, when the phantom was finally caught, one of those killers tried to hide inside a second identity, a fabricated personality named Steve, invented to convince the courts that Kenneth Bianchi was not responsible for what Kenneth Bianchi had done. 2 men disguised as one, then 1 man disguised as 2. And here is the question that will follow us through this entire case. If a man with no medical training, no psychology degree, and a stack of library books could fool experienced forensic psychiatrists into diagnosing a disorder he did not have, how much of what we think we know about the criminal mind is knowledge, and how much of it is what the criminal wants us to see? To understand how the lie was built, you have to go back before Los Angeles, before the hillsides, back to Rochester, New York, in May of 1951, when a 17-year-old alcoholic sex worker gave birth to a boy she could not raise. The infant was passed between foster placements before being adopted at 3 months old by Francis and Nicholas Bianchi. Francis was anxious, overprotective, and volatile. Nicholas was a foundry worker who stuttered and stayed quiet. The boy they named Kenneth Alessio Bianchi grew up in a house where love arrived unpredictably and discipline arrived the same way. The early file on Kenneth Bianchi reads like a checklist that no one checked. As a young child, he was a compulsive daydreamer, prone to trance-like lapses that doctors flagged but never resolved. He wet the bed for years. He was taken to physicians repeatedly by a mother who both smothered him and dragged him from clinic to clinic, and evaluators noted a boy who was dependent, seething with quiet hostility, and already skilled at telling adults exactly what they wanted to hear. By 11, a school evaluation found his performance far below his ability. His temper flared in bursts, then vanished behind a smile. Teachers described a boy who lied fluently, not to escape punishment, but as a way of being. The lying was the personality, and that detail matters more than any other in his childhood record, because everything Kenneth Bianchi would ever become was an elaboration of that single skill, the fluent, frictionless, undetectable lie. His adoptive father died of a heart attack when Kenneth was 13. Whatever anchor Nicholas had provided was gone. Kenneth drifted through adolescence in Rochester, married briefly at 20, abandoned by his young wife within months, rejected when he tried to join the sheriff's department. That rejection is worth pausing on. Bianchi wanted to be a police officer. He applied. He was turned away, and when the badge was denied to him, he began collecting the costume instead. He took security guard jobs, which gave him a uniform. He acquired a fake police badge. He studied the language and posture of law enforcement the way an actor studies a role. Years later, that stolen authority would become the murder weapon that never showed up on any autopsy report. Because the first thing the Hillside Stranglers used on every victim was not a rope. It was trust. In early 1976, Bianchi left Rochester and drove west to Los Angeles, following the one-family connection he had in California, his adoptive mother's nephew, an older cousin, a man named Angelo Buono Jr. If Kenneth Bianchi was a lie wearing a nice sweater, Angelo Buono was cruelty that never bothered with the disguise. 17 years older than his cousin, Buono ran an upholstery shop attached to his home on Colorado Street in Glendale, a working-class corner of Los Angeles County. He was a skilled tradesman with a legitimate business, a man who fixed car interiors for a living, and privately, a man with a documented history of brutality toward women that stretched back decades. Married multiple times, accused by former wives of violence and sexual abuse, Buono treated the women in his life as property to be used and discarded. He fathered several children and terrorized their mothers. Where Bianchi craved approval, Buono radiated contempt. Where Bianchi performed charm, Buono performed dominance. Neighbors knew him as Angelo, the upholstery guy. The women who passed through his house knew someone else entirely. When Bianchi arrived in Los Angeles, Buono took him in and took him under instruction. The older cousin mocked the younger one, belittled him, and simultaneously became the model of masculinity Bianchi had never had. Psychologists who later studied the pair described a dynamic that criminologists consider one of the most dangerous configurations that exists: a dominant, sadistic personality paired with a dependent, compliant one. Each man enabling behavior the other might never have sustained alone. Buono supplied the appetite and the authority. Bianchi supplied the eagerness of a man auditioning for his cousin's respect. Alone, Buono had been an abuser. Alone, Bianchi had been a fraud. Together, they became something the city of Los Angeles had no name for yet. The descent did not begin with murder. It began with commerce. In 1977, the cousins moved into pimping, luring vulnerable teenage girls, confiscating their identification and forcing them into prostitution run out of Buono's house, enforced with threats and violence. The enterprise was small, vicious, and unstable. One of the girls escaped, another followed. The income collapsed. And in the wreckage of that failed operation came a transaction that investigators would later mark as the ignition point of everything. The cousins purchased a so-called trick list, a roster of clients, from a prostitute named Deborah Noble. When Noble delivered the list, she brought a friend along with her. The friend's name was Yolanda Washington. The list turned out to be worthless, and the cousins felt cheated. Their rage fixed not on the woman who sold it to them, but on the woman who had simply been standing there. On October 18, 1977, the body of 19-year-old Yolanda Washington was found on a hillside near the Ventura Freeway, close to the gates of Forest Lawn Cemetery. She had been raped and strangled. Detectives noticed something else, something quieter and stranger than the violence itself. The body had been cleaned. Faint ligature marks circled the neck, the wrists, the ankles. Whoever had done this had taken time afterward, removing evidence, arranging the scene, treating the aftermath of a murder with the calm of a tradesman finishing a job. One victim. No witnesses, no physical evidence worth the name. In a city the size of Los Angeles, the death of a young sex worker on a freeway embankment did not make the front page. No one knew it yet, but the count had started. 2 weeks later, on the last day of October, the body of 15-year-old Judith Miller, a runaway who had been surviving on the streets of Hollywood, was found in a flower bed in La Crescenta. Same signature. Ligature strangulation, the body cleaned and deliberately placed. Then, 9 days after that, 21-year-old Lissa Castin, a waitress and dancer, was found near the Chevy Chase Country Club in Glendale. 3 young women in 3 weeks, arranged on the slopes of northeast Los Angeles, like a message no one had translated yet. Within the police departments, and there were several because the bodies were falling across multiple jurisdictions, detectives began to see the pattern. The press had not caught it yet. The city was still asleep. November 1977 is the month Los Angeles woke up. In a single stretch of days around Thanksgiving, the toll accelerated with a speed that shattered every assumption investigators had been working with. 20-year-old Christina Weckler, an honors art student, was taken from her apartment building in Glendale, a building where, in a detail that should have ended the case a year earlier than it did, Kenneth Bianchi had once lived just doors away. 28-year-old Jane King, an aspiring actress, was found near an off-ramp of the Golden State Freeway. 18-year-old Lauren Wagner, a business student, was taken almost in front of her own home, with a witness across the street watching part of the abduction without understanding what she was seeing. And then came the discovery that removed whatever category the public had been using to keep this at a distance. On November 20th, on a hillside in Elysian Park, searchers found the bodies of 2 children, Dolores Cepeda, 12 years old, and Sonia Johnson, 14. 2 schoolgirls who had gotten off a bus together and never made it home. They had last been seen approaching a car, and witnesses would later recall the girls seemed to trust whoever was inside it. That detail, the trust, was the thread running through every scene, and it was the thread that terrified investigators most. There were no defense wounds, no signs of struggle at the abduction sites. Victims were vanishing from bus stops, from their own streets, from middle-class neighborhoods, and going somewhere willingly before they died. Detectives Frank Salerno of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and Bob Grogan of the LAPD Two investigators who would carry this case for years kept returning to the same impossible question. What kind of predator can make a smart, cautious young woman get into a car without a fight in a city where every woman now knew a killer was hunting? The answer, when it finally came, would explain everything. The victims went along, Grogan would later say, because they believed they were obeying the law. Two men. A badge held up to the window, a calm instruction, "We're police officers, you need to come with us." The Hillside Strangler wasn't breaking into anyone's life. He was being invited in, wearing the exact authority Kenneth Bianchi had been rejected for, and had decided to counterfeit instead. By December, the Phantom had a name. The press, tracking the geography of the dump sites, had christened the killer the Hillside Strangler, singular, one man, one monster, and the city responded the way cities do when the threat has no face. Young women stopped going out after dark. Gun sales climbed. Hitchhiking, still common in 70s Los Angeles, evaporated. Women were warned not to pull over for unmarked police cars, which created a second layer of civic damage. The killer's method had poisoned the public's trust in the police themselves. A task force of more than 100 officers from the LAPD, the Sheriff's Department, and the Glendale Police worked leads by the thousands. The mayor's office fielded panic. Psychics called. False confessors lined up. And through all of it, the two men responsible drove the same streets as everyone else. One of them a business owner whose upholstery shop on Colorado Street in Glendale sat inside the geographic heart of the murder map, because that was the other secret hiding in plain sight. With a single exception, every murder attributed to the Hillside Strangler happened in the same place. Not on the hillsides. The hillsides were only the display. The killing floor was a small house attached to an auto upholstery business, where a middle-aged tradesman and his polite younger cousin brought their victims, and where no neighbor ever heard enough to call the police. The body of 17-year-old Kimberly Martin, a call girl dispatched to an address the killers had chosen for its emptiness, was found in December on a vacant lot near City Hall. And then, in February 1978, 20-year-old Cindy Hudspeth, a student and part-time waitress, was found in the trunk of her own orange Datsun, pushed off a cliff on the Angeles Crest Highway, spotted by a helicopter pilot who had no idea he was looking at the final victim of the Hillside Strangler. 10 women and girls in 4 months. And then, nothing. The murders stopped as abruptly as they had begun. No arrest, no suspect, no explanation. The task force kept working a case that had gone cold in its hands. The city slowly exhaled, and the phantom the newspapers had built, the single monstrous Hillside Strangler, simply dissolved back into the population. What the task force could not know was that the partnership had fractured. The two men who had operated as one identity were coming apart. The dominant half increasingly convinced that the dependent half was a liability, careless, addicted to attention, incapable of silence. Angelo Buono wanted Kenneth Bianchi gone, and in early 1978 he got his wish. Bianchi packed his car and drove north, following his girlfriend, Kelly Boyd, and their infant son to her hometown, Bellingham, Washington. A quiet college town near the Canadian border, a place with a murder rate close to 0. Bianchi took a job as a security guard, and for almost a year, the man who had been half of the Hillside Strangler lived as a young father in a town where people didn't lock their doors. Then, in January 1979, 2 young women in Bellingham accepted a house-sitting job that paid suspiciously well. Their names were Karen Mandic and Diane Wilder, both students at Western Washington University. The job had been arranged, personally and privately, by a local security guard the girls had no reason to distrust. Within 24 hours, both women were dead, strangled, left in Karen's car on a dead-end street. And this time, there was no phantom to hide inside. This time, the last person known to have contact with the victims had a name, a schedule, and an address. The Bellingham police, in a town unaccustomed to homicide, did what the 100-officer task force in Los Angeles had been unable to do for a year. Within days, they arrested Kenneth Bianchi, and it is here, with Bianchi in a cell, with physical evidence tying him to 2 murders, with a routine records check about to connect his old Los Angeles addresses to the Strangler victim's own streets, that the second lie begins. Because Kenneth Bianchi, cornered, did what Kenneth Bianchi had done since childhood, the one thing he had always been better at than anyone around him. He looked at the people holding his future in their hands, calculated exactly what they wanted to see, and began to build it. The Bellingham case against Kenneth Bianchi assembled itself with almost mundane efficiency, and that efficiency is worth studying because it exposes what had gone wrong in Los Angeles. In the small town, anomalies are visible. Karen Mandic had told her boyfriend about the house-sitting job before she died, including the name of the man who arranged it and the strange instruction to keep the job secret. Bianchi had told his employer conflicting stories about his whereabouts that night. A security schedule placed him where he claimed not to be. And when detectives searched the house the women had been lured to, and then Bianchi's own home, the physical evidence began to accumulate. Fibers, a pubic hair consistent with Bianchi's, items stolen from properties he had guarded. There was no phantom to absorb suspicion, no ocean of 10 million people to disappear into. Bellingham police looked at the last man known to have spoken to the victims, and the last man known to have spoken to the victims was the killer. It took days, not years, but the arrest in Bellingham triggered something larger. A detective ran a routine background check on the polite security guard from California and started making telephone calls to Los Angeles. On one of those calls, a Bellingham investigator described the facts of his case to the sheriff's detectives. 2 young women, ligature strangulation, no struggle, and was asked a question that changed the direction of American criminal history. Have you ever heard about the Hillside Strangler? The investigator pulled Bianchi's records from the Department of Motor Vehicles, and the addresses came back like a confession written in bureaucratic ink. Kenneth Alessio Bianchi, 809 East Garfield, the same building where victim Christina Veckler had lived, doors away from the apartment she was taken from. Another Bianchi address on Corona Street, traced to the same orbit as Cindy Hudspeth. The man in the Bellingham jail cell had not merely lived in Los Angeles during the murders. He had lived on top of the victim map. Frank Salerno and his partner flew north. For the Los Angeles task force, this was the moment a year of dead ends collapsed into a single suspect, and the beginning of a legal problem no one had fully anticipated. Because the physical evidence connecting Bianchi to the Los Angeles murders was thin. The bodies had been cleaned. The crime scenes were dump sites, not killing sites. Witnesses had seen 2 men and described them inconsistently. If Bianchi was one half of the Hillside Strangler, the prosecution's road to proving it and to reaching the second half ran directly through Bianchi's cooperation. Everyone in that jail understood the geometry of the situation, and no one understood it faster than the prisoner himself. Kenneth Bianchi held one card, and it was enormous. He was the only living witness who could name the other killer. What happened next is the reason this case belongs in the history of forensic psychiatry and not just the history of murder. Bianchi's defense attorney, confronted with the Bellingham evidence, began exploring an insanity defense, and Bianchi, given access to the concept, seized it with the instincts of a lifelong performer. He reported blackouts, lost time, headaches, dreams he could not explain. He was, by his own careful account, a man with holes in his memory precisely where the murders were, and it happened that the cultural moment was perfectly primed for this story. The 70s had made multiple personality disorder famous. The book and film, Sybil had brought dissociative identity into every American living room. The Three Faces of Eve was a classic. The condition was rare, dramatic, cinematic, and its diagnostic gatekeeping ran on hypnosis, a technique whose results depended heavily on the examiner's own expectations. Into this environment walked Kenneth Bianchi, a man whose entire developmental history was one long apprenticeship in telling authority figures what they wanted to hear. In March 1979, under hypnosis administered by psychologist John Watkins, a nationally respected expert in dissociation, the performance premiered. Watkins invited any hidden part of Kenneth to come forward. The prisoner's head sank, and a second voice arrived, introducing itself as Steve. Steve Walker. Everything about Steve was engineered as Ken's negative image. Where Ken was gentle, Steve sneered. Where Ken was cooperative, Steve was profane. Where Ken claimed innocence, Steve boasted. Steve hated Ken, mocked him as a turkey, laughed about how Ken lost time like a broken clock, and Steve confessed, not vaguely, specifically. Steve described killing the girls in Los Angeles, and he handed investigators the name they had flown 1,000 miles to hear. His cousin, Angelo. Steve said Angelo was in it with him, described the house on Colorado Street, described details of the crimes that no false confessor had ever produced. Consider the diabolical elegance of the construction, because it deserves to be understood as a piece of engineering. With a single invented personality, Bianchi accomplished 4 objectives simultaneously. He confessed to the murders, which the evidence was going to prove anyway. He directed the confession away from himself, into a phantom the law could arguably not punish. He delivered Angelo Buono to the prosecutors, converting his most dangerous liability, being the only witness, into his most valuable asset. And he transformed himself, in the eyes of the examining experts, from a suspect into a patient. Watkins came away persuaded. So, in succession, did other credentialed examiners. Multiple experts concluded that Kenneth Bianchi suffered from a genuine dissociative disorder, that the all-American young man was legally insane, a passenger in his own body, while an alter personality committed the atrocities. If that conclusion had held, Kenneth Bianchi would have been heading not to a penitentiary, but to a hospital, with the theoretical possibility of one day being certified cured. It very nearly held. What broke it was not a detective. It was a skeptic with a clipboard. And the story of how the fraud unraveled is a masterclass in the difference between believing a patient and testing one. The prosecution brought in Dr. Martin Orne, a psychiatrist from the University of Pennsylvania, and one of the world's foremost authorities on hypnosis, specifically on the question of whether hypnosis could be faked, a subject he had spent his career studying. Orne's approach was fundamentally different from that of the examiners who had come before him. He did not ask whether Steve was real. He designed traps to find out. Before one session, Orne mentioned to Bianchi, casually, as if sharing a professional observation, that in genuine cases of multiple personality disorder, there were usually more than two personalities. It was bait. A real patient's condition does not reorganize itself to match an examiner's offhand remark. But Kenneth Bianchi was not a patient. He was a performer taking notes. In the very next hypnotic session, right on schedule, a third personality emerged, a frightened, childlike alter, calling itself Billy. The disorder had expanded to meet specifications, like a contractor revising a blueprint after a client meeting. Orne layered test upon test. He observed that Bianchi's behavior under supposed hypnosis contradicted the known phenomenology of genuine trance in subtle ways a textbook would not teach. Overacting hallucinations, physically touching a hallucinated person when truly hypnotized subjects typically do not, dramatizing in the direction of what a layman imagines hypnosis looks like. Meanwhile, investigators did something that should have been done first. They checked the paperwork behind the phantom. The name Steve Walker had not risen from the depths of a fractured psyche. It belonged to a real person, a real Thomas Stephen Walker, a psychology graduate whose identity Bianchi had stolen in California in a scheme to obtain fraudulent credentials. Bianchi, it emerged, had answered Walker's job application, obtained his transcripts, and used them to acquire a fake psychology diploma in his own name. The hidden personality was a recycled alias from a con job. And the search of Bianchi's belongings completed the picture: textbooks on psychology, material on hypnosis and dissociation. The man had studied for the role. He had built Steve the way he had built every other version of himself: the aspiring cop, the security professional, the fake psychologist, the loving father, from research, observation, and an unerring sense of audience. There is a moment worth freezing here, because it is the analytical heart of this entire case. Multiple trained experts had sat across from Kenneth Bianchi and diagnosed a rare disorder. They were not fools. They were experienced clinicians applying the tools of their era in good faith. What Bianchi exposed, and what Martin Orne proved, was a structural vulnerability in forensic psychology itself. An examination that depends on the subject's self-report can be gamed by a subject with no conscience and a talent for reading the examiner. Bianchi had spent his childhood learning that adults reward the version of you they expect to find. In Bellingham, with his life on the line, he simply performed that childhood lesson at professional grade. The court-appointed experts ultimately split. The fraud dominated the sanity hearing, and in October 1979, Kenneth Bianchi's insanity gambit collapsed. Facing the death penalty in Washington and overwhelming evidence in 2 states, he took the only exit remaining: a deal. Bianchi pleaded guilty to the Bellingham murders and to 5 of the Hillside Strangler murders in California, and in exchange for avoiding execution, he agreed to become the state's star witness against the man still walking free in Glendale. That same month, October 1979, detectives arrested Angelo Buono at his upholstery shop. For the task force, it was the finish line of a 2-year marathon. For the prosecutors, it was the starting line of a nightmare, because their entire case now rested on the sworn testimony of a man who had just been exposed, publicly and spectacularly, as one of the most gifted liars American forensic psychiatry had ever examined. And Kenneth Bianchi, transferred to California to fulfill his bargain, began to demonstrate exactly what his testimony was worth. On the witness stand and in pre-trial proceedings, he shifted, hedged, recanted, and reconfessed. He claimed memory problems. He gave versions that contradicted his previous versions, whether this was revenge against the deal, fear of Buono, or simply the compulsive static of a personality that lied the way other people breathe. The effect was catastrophic. The prosecution's central witness was a man no juror could be asked to believe. In 1981, the situation reached a point that remains almost unbelievable in the annals of American justice. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, assessing Bianchi as fatally unreliable, moved to dismiss all charges against Angelo Buono. The prosecutors of the Hillside Strangler case stood up in court and asked to let the Hillside Strangler go. The motion landed on the desk of Superior Court Judge Ronald George. What happened next is one of the most consequential judicial decisions in California history, and the reason Angelo Buono did not die a free man. Judge Ronald George read the motion to dismiss, and then he did something trial judges almost never do. He said no. Prosecutors hold enormous discretion over their own cases, and when a district attorney concludes that a prosecution cannot succeed, courts almost universally defer. George refused. In a ruling that stunned both tables, he rejected the dismissal, stating in substance that the evidence, independent of Kenneth Bianchi's corroded credibility, was sufficient for a jury to hear, and that the decision of guilt or innocence in a case of this magnitude belonged to that jury, not to a prosecutor's risk assessment. If the district attorney's office would not try Angelo Buono, the case would be handed to someone who would. The office of the California Attorney General took over the prosecution. It is difficult to overstate how rare this sequence is. A judge effectively overruled the government's decision to abandon the Hillside Strangler case, and in doing so, kept alive the only path to holding the dominant half of the partnership accountable. Ronald George would later become Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. Asked the families of 10 murdered women and girls which of his rulings mattered most. What followed was, at the time, the longest criminal trial in the history of the United States. The prosecution of Angelo Buono Jr. ran from November 1981 to November 1983. 2 years of testimony, roughly 400 witnesses, tens of thousands of pages of transcript. And the architecture of the case had been forced by Bianchi's unreliability into something unusual for its era. The prosecutors could not simply present their witness and rest. They had to build a corroborated skeleton around every claim he made. Physical evidence, fiber analysis linking victims to Buono's house and vehicles, witness testimony placing victims in the cousin's orbit, the testimony of the young women who had survived the pimping operation and could describe from inside the machinery of coercion that operated behind the upholstery shop. One of those survivors described Buono's home in detail, a house with no doors on the rooms, no privacy anywhere, a structure built for control. The jury heard the phantom of the Hillside Strangler dismantled piece by piece and reassembled as something far more disturbing than a monster, a business address. And through the middle of that marathon walked Kenneth Bianchi, the witness the prosecution needed and could not trust. On the stand, he performed exactly as forecast, evasive, contradictory, alternately confessing and retreating, a man visibly negotiating with his own testimony in real time. The defense hammered the obvious point. This was a proven liar who had fooled trained psychiatrists, a man who had every incentive to fabricate his cousin's involvement to save his own life. There was a real possibility, acknowledged even inside the prosecution, that the jury would conclude Bianchi had acted alone and invented Angelo the same way he had invented Steve. The corroboration is what closed that door. Fibers, locations, patterns, survivors. A tapestry of independent evidence that did not care whether Kenneth Bianchi was lying on any given afternoon. But to understand what the jury was truly weighing, the analysis has to return to the victims, because the pattern of the crimes, reconstructed at trial, is the clearest window into the psychology of the partnership. The Hillside Stranglers did not select victims the way the public imagines serial predators do, stalking a specific physical type. Their selection pattern was opportunistic and accelerating, and that acceleration tells its own story. They began with victims the world was slowest to grieve, sex workers, runaways, where the risk of intense investigation was lowest. When nothing happened to them, they moved inward. Students, working women, women taken from middle-class streets, and then children. Dolores Cepeda and Sonia Johnson, 12 and 14, taken off a bus route. Criminal psychologists describe this trajectory as escalation through impunity. Each unsolved murder functioned as permission for the next, and the selection widened as the fear of consequence shrank. The cruelty was not static. It was compounding, the torture documented on the later victims exceeding the earlier ones, the two men reportedly experimenting as the spree progressed. This is what a partnership does that a lone killer often cannot sustain. Each participant performs for the other, and the audience effect dissolves the internal brakes that might slow a man acting alone. Buono and Bianchi were not only killing women, they were, in the coldest analytical framing, demonstrating to each other that they could. The police impersonation deserves its own forensic paragraph, because it was the load-bearing wall of the entire operation. Every element of the cousins' method was designed to weaponize legitimacy. The badge, the unmarked car, the calm procedural language of a traffic stop or an arrest. Victims complied because compliance with police is what society trains its citizens, especially its young women, to do. This is why there were no defense wounds, no screams, no witnesses to violent abduction. The abductions did not look like abductions. They looked like law enforcement. And when the truth emerged, it inflicted a wound on Los Angeles that outlived the murders themselves, a civic injury measurable in the warnings that went out across the city. If an unmarked car signals you to pull over, do not stop. A serial murder case had made the police badge itself an object of suspicion. Investigators understood the perversity at the center of it. The method belonged to a man who had been rejected by law enforcement and had spent his adult life counterfeiting its authority, first for status, then for income, and finally for hunting. While the Buono trial ground forward in Los Angeles, the case produced one more chapter, and it may be the strangest verified chapter in the file, because it demonstrates that Kenneth Bianchi's capacity for manipulation did not require his freedom, his credibility, or even physical proximity. It required only an audience of one. In 1980, while awaiting proceedings, Bianchi began corresponding with a woman named Veronica Compton, an aspiring playwright with an obsessive fascination for the case, who was working on material about a female serial killer. Their correspondence became a relationship, The relationship became, on Compton's side, a consuming devotion, and Bianchi, reading her the way he read everyone, deployed her. The plan they developed was engineered to attack the one thing the prosecution's case could not survive losing, the premise that the Hillside Strangler was in custody. Compton traveled to Bellingham. Her assignment was to lure a woman to a motel and strangle her, staging the scene with the strangler's signature. And Bianchi supplied the forensic centerpiece, smuggling to her a quantity of his own semen hidden in the spine of a book, so that biological evidence at the new crime scene would appear to prove the real killer was still at large, and the man in custody was innocent. In September 1980, Compton attempted it. She lured a young woman to a motel room and attacked her, attempting strangulation. The victim, a cocktail waitress named Kim Breed, fought back, broke free, and survived. Compton fled, was identified, arrested, and convicted of attempted murder. The scheme collapsed, but sit with what it revealed. A man in a jail cell, already exposed as a fraud by the psychiatric establishment, already destroyed as a courtroom witness, had nonetheless persuaded a woman with no criminal history to attempt a murder on his behalf, to try to kill a stranger so that his lie could live. Every previous deception in Bianchi's file had been defensive, escaping consequences, dodging diagnoses, negotiating deals. The Compton Plot was something else. It was manipulation as pure production, the manufacture of a new crime, a new victim, a new false narrative, orchestrated entirely through words on paper. If the question of this case is how far a manipulator can reach, the Compton file is the measured answer. Through prison walls, into the hands of a free citizen, around the throat of a woman he had never met. On November 14, 1983, after 2 years of trial, the jury returned its verdicts on Angelo Buono Jr., guilty of 9 of the 10 Hillside Strangler murders, acquitted only in the count concerning Yolanda Washington, the first victim, where the corroborating evidence was thinnest. The jury declined to impose the death penalty, and in January 1984, Buono was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's remarks at sentencing carried the unmistakable tone of a system that felt the punishment fell short of the crime, regret expressed from the bench that the 2 men would be spared the fate they had inflicted on 10 women and girls, in significant part because the state's deal with Bianchi had taken execution off the table. Bianchi himself, having violated the spirit of his plea agreement with his courtroom sabotage, was shipped back to Washington state to serve his sentences in a penitentiary rather than the more comfortable California facility he had bargained for. A small, bureaucratic revenge, and the only price his manipulation of the trial ever directly cost him. Angelo Buono died of a heart attack in his cell at Calipatria State Prison on September 21, 2002, at the age of 67. He gave no confession, no interviews of substance, no account of himself. The dominant half of the Hillside Strangler exited the story silent, leaving the entire narrative of what happened inside that house on Colorado Street in the custody of the one man no one can believe, and that is the condition the case remains in today. Kenneth Bianchi is still alive, still in Washington State Penitentiary, denied parole again and again, 8 times and counting. He has spent 4 decades revising his story, minimizing, recanting, at times suggesting his confessions were coerced, at times performing contrition, most recently emerging for his first on-camera interview in a new documentary series, at 74 years old, still auditioning for an audience. Every few years, the file reopens somewhere, a parole hearing, a documentary, a podcast, and each time the public is invited to look once more into that mild, cooperative face and ask the question the psychiatrists of 1979 got wrong. Return then to the room where this story truly turns. Not a hillside, not a courtroom. A small examination room in Washington State, 1979, because the decisive battle of the Hillside Strangler case was not fought with warrants or forensics. It was fought across a table between two men over the question of whether a human being can be trusted to report the contents of his own mind, reconstruct the scene as the record preserves it. Kenneth Bianchi sits in the chair, 27 years old, facing the death penalty in 2 states. Across from him sits Dr. Martin Orne, a man who has spent his entire professional life studying one narrow, profound question. How do you tell a real hypnotic trance from a performance of one? Orne knows things about hypnosis that almost no one else alive knows. He knows that genuinely hypnotized subjects behave in specific, counterintuitive ways. That when a hypnotized person hallucinates someone sitting in an empty chair, they typically accept the impossible logic of the hallucination without testing it, while a faker, playing to an imagined audience, reaches out to shake the phantom's hand. He knows that real trance is understated and performance is theatrical. And above all, he knows that a genuine disorder does not read the examiner's mind, but a con man does nothing else. So Orne sets the trap. Before the session begins, in what sounds like casual professional conversation, he plants a single false seed. It's unusual, he remarks, for a true multiple personality to have only 2 identities. Genuine cases usually have more. It is a throwaway line. A real patient's psyche would not hear it, would not care, would not restructure itself overnight to satisfy it. And then the session begins. The hypnotic induction proceeds, and Orne watches Kenneth Bianchi's face, polite, cooperative, eager to help, sink toward his chest. When it rises again, the room contains someone new, not Steve, the snarling killer, someone smaller, a frightened, childlike voice introducing itself as Billy. A third personality, arriving on cue, 1 session after the examiner had specified that the disorder was incomplete. The blueprint had been revised to the client's specifications. Somewhere behind those closed eyes, the contractor was taking notes. That single moment, a fictional child's voice, summoned into existence by a psychiatrist's deliberate lie, is the entire Hillside Strangler case in miniature. It contains everything: the fluency of the deception, the responsiveness to audience, the total absence of anything underneath the performance. And it was checkable. That was Orne's genius, and the corrective the earlier examiners had skipped. He converted belief into experiment. The paperwork did the rest. Steve Walker, the name of the murderous alter, turned out to be filed in the records of a California diploma fraud, a real graduate student whose transcripts Bianchi had harvested years earlier to counterfeit a psychology credential. Investigators laid the 2 files side by side. The psychiatric file, in which Steve was a spontaneous eruption from a fractured unconscious, and the fraud file, in which Steve was a stolen identity from a mail scam, and the multiple personality defense died on the table between them. The books on psychology and hypnosis recovered from Bianchi's possessions were simply the bibliography. He had researched the role, cast himself, rehearsed the voice, and opened to an audience of experts. 4 of them had believed him. It took the fifth to check his sources. Understand what was at stake in that room, because it was much larger than one man's sentence. If the performance had held, Kenneth Bianchi, the half of the Hillside Strangler whose charm made the abductions possible, the man who helped rape, torture and strangle women and children and then went home to his girlfriend and infant son, would have been adjudicated insane. Hospitalized, not imprisoned, eligible in principle for eventual release upon a finding that the illness had resolved. And the illness would have resolved because there was no illness, only an actor who could retire the character the moment it finished serving its purpose. Every future manipulator watching that case would have learned the lesson. The exit from a murder conviction runs through a psychiatrist's office, and the door opens from the inside. Orne's traps closed that door. The sanity hearing collapsed. The plea deal followed, Buono fell, and forensic psychiatry absorbed a wound that became a vaccine. Because the discipline did change. The Bianchi case became a foundational citation in the study of malingering, the clinical term for faking disorder for gain, taught in forensic psychology programs as the definitive demonstration that dissociative claims in a legal setting must be tested, not received. It reshaped professional skepticism toward hypnotically retrieved testimony. It forced examiners to confront an uncomfortable structural truth, that the interview room is an adversarial environment pretending to be a therapeutic one, and that a subject with everything to lose and no conscience to spend will treat a diagnosis the way he treats any other lock, as a mechanism to be studied and picked. The experts who believed Bianchi were not incompetent. They were operating a system whose central assumption, that the patient is trying to be understood, had never been stress-tested against a man whose entire personality was a countermeasure. And the two schoolgirls, and the honor student, and the aspiring actress, and the waitress, and the teenagers, and the young women whose names close this file, Yolanda Washington, Judith Miller, Lissa Castin, Jane King, Dolores Cepeda, Sonia Johnson, Christina Weckler, Lauren Wagner, Kimberly Martin, Cindy Hudspeth, and in Washington, Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder. They were killed by that same countermeasure operating in the world. Strip away the phantom, the altars, the courtroom theater, and the method was always identical. From the first Hillside to the last hypnosis session, identify what the target trusts and wear it. Young women trusted the police, so the killers wore a badge. Psychiatrists trusted the reality of dissociation, so the killer wore a disorder. Prosecutors trusted the self-interest of a plea bargain, so the witness wore cooperation. A lonely playwright trusted love, so the prisoner wore devotion. 12 people died, and one nearly did. Inside the gap between what Kenneth Bianchi appeared to be and what he was. And the appearance was never accidental. It was the product. It was the only thing he ever manufactured. That is what this case ultimately reveals about the human mind. And it is not a comfortable finding because it is not about the mind of a killer. It is about ours. Every system that failed in this case failed at the same joint, the point where verification was replaced by trust. Los Angeles could not see two ordinary men inside the silhouette of one monster because the city trusted its own picture of what a serial killer looks like. The victims could not see murderers inside a police stop because they trusted the badge. The clinicians could not see an actor inside a patient because they trusted the interview. The lesson of the Hillside Stranglers is not that monsters walk among us. The channel's archive proves that on every file. The lesson is more precise and colder. The most dangerous predators do not defeat our defenses, they enroll them. They study what we are prepared to believe, and they arrive already shaped like it. Kenneth Bianchi never once broke into anything, not a home, not a car, not a mind. He was invited in every single time. He is still performing. Somewhere in a Washington penitentiary, an old man continues to refine the story. A new interview, a new emphasis, a new audience born every few years that never watched the original show. The parole board has said no 8 times. The cameras keep coming back. And every viewer who looks into that calm, accommodating face is taking the same test the psychiatrists took in 1979, the test the victims never knew they were taking on the streets of Los Angeles, the quiet, constant, unglamorous discipline of asking of anyone, no matter how harmless they appear, not what they show you, but what checks out. If this case stayed with you, the archive holds others. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Some of them fooled everyone for years. Some of them are still fooling people now. And if you take one thing from this file, let it be the question that finally broke Kenneth Bianchi. The only question that ever works. Don't ask if the story is convincing. Ask if it can be verified. The next case is already open.